Welcome and thanks for joining today's webinar, which forms part of our series of broadcasts we are using to share the learning from the local delivery pilots. I'm Adam Rigsford, Strategic Lead at Sport England, and we will be facilitating today's session. As you may know, during June we delivered 3 community of learning workshops across the country, which were attended by over 120 delegates. These workshops included a session on emerging learning so far from the pilots, and we used to share some commonly occurring themes from the pilots to date, which we think have significance and relevance across the sector. Today's webinar will be delivered by Naomi Shearon, our Strategic Lead for Market Insight, and Jason Fergus from the Essex Local Delivery Pilot and Active Essex, the County Active Partnership. And we'll revisit the emerging learning session we presented at the workshops in the last couple of weeks. Before we start, there are just a couple of housekeeping topics I wanted to raise. We'd welcome questions from those listening today. As you are listening to the presentation, if you have a question that you would like to ask Naomi, Jason or myself, please use the Ask a Question tab on the right-hand side of the auditorium. It's worth reminding people that the presentation will be available on demand shortly after the event, where anyone who has registered will be able to watch the event again in their own time. If anyone has any issues seeing or hearing the webinar, then there is a Test Your Connection button on your auditorium page, which will allow you to see your connection status. If you do have a problem, please let us know through the Ask a Question tab, and this will be dealt with by colleagues who are hosting the webinar for us. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Naomi and Jason to take you through our recent learning.
Thanks, Adam. So we're going to talk through a few themes, a few learning themes. We don't have especially long, there's only so much listening I think anyone can do it in one session. So we are going to focus on these sorts of top level themes for now. For anyone who's attended our community of learning events, typically how they run is a lot of the time is spent with the pilots talking in depth and detail about what is specifically happening. And then we try and wrap that up, sort of elevate some themes for people around some of the things they may have heard that perhaps felt the most significant. And that's the bit that we're going to essentially repeat today. And it's fantastic to have Jason here from Essex, who can ground some of that in reality.
Absolutely, thank you. Really looking forward to sharing some of the journey that we've been on in Essex, and hopefully some of that will resonate with you as we go through the next hour or so. Thank you.
So where does this come from before we go into what it actually tells us? One of the things straight away that we've tried to do really differently with the local delivery pilots as Sport England and within the pilots is create a sort of live learning reflection culture. So I guess rather than gathering up evaluation material at major milestones or towards the end of investments and thinking about what it showed us and what we learned, we're trying to do that in a much more live way. So essentially what that means is continuously creating space to pause and think about what's happening, what we're observing, why that matters, and what we should all do about it. And the other thing that's really quite different is, and quite scary I think for everyone, it's fair to say, is sharing as we go. So not waiting till we have a perfect story, a perfect picture of everything that's gone on and what it's meant and what it's done, and more our story of now. So what is happening, why do we think it matters, and crucially, what do we think other people can take from it? What is transferable to other people at this point in time? That has been quite different, hasn't it, Jason? It's felt different.
Absolutely, and I think that's really important to share, that the journey that we've been on thus far, we feel absolutely a responsibility as 12 pilots to ensure that we're sharing that with you. That's come about through the learning workshops that you've attended, but also, for example, in Essex, we've created 2 chapters. This is about a story, and our Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 thus far, which is available on our website, shares the journey, the challenges, the successes of the pilot journey so far. And this is what, for me and for Essex, makes it so different. This is not about a programme at the end, we evaluate it, we actually do it as we go along and we reflect and take that time to reflect, but also, as Naomi just said, absolutely critical about how we're sharing that learning, because we're only going to get better as a sector if we share, and I think this is a really good opportunity to ensure that we all do that together collectively.
Yeah, wonderful. So we're going to move on to some of the themes, and I'm going to talk at a sort of collective level. So every 6 months we sort of gather in these stories that are emerging from the pilots, these learnings, what we feel is transferable, And we try to group that into some common experiences. And as I say, we're sort of calling that our story of now. So what does it feel like? What's happening? Why does that matter in terms of the collective effort of the 12 pilots? And actually the first theme, growing a movement, allows me to go back a little bit for people who might be quite new to this. I don't want to assume everyone's come on this journey with us from the start. And talk about, firstly, the basic premise, the central purpose of the pilot. So very, very briefly, the central purpose of the pilot is that very many things influence how active people are. We know this now. Their own beliefs and motivations matter, but so too does their family, their friends, what's normal for the people around them, what's happening to them at work, so to the extent to which their workplace, their workspace, their work hours, the flexibility allows them to make choices, to travel there, for example, in an active way, to take time at work to do activity. School, the way that influences children. Every time we go to a doctor, when we go and see a specialist, places and spaces, the physical space in which we live and work, how that's shaping our choices all the time. And also the policies, so big and small, so choices, big choices that are made about how much money is spent in what ways, with what connectivity in places, but small as well. In the example we always use is codes and regulations. So you might have estates with no ball games, parks with no cycling, and these things that start to shape people's behaviour all the time. So the central purpose is to start with what influences people the most and try to influence those things. And I think people will recognise that that's quite different from thinking about, for example, we want to join up these 3 clubs, or we want to join Leisure Up with Health. It's starting with people, what influences them most, and trying to influence those things and people to build activity in, so that being active is just the easiest choice in life. So I think when I talk through what this is all about and what it's for, it's probably pretty obvious that growing a movement is central to the work of the pilots. In the first 6 months, and this is a bit of a shameless plug to one of our existing webinars, if you would like to go back, we did a version of this 6 months ago, which was a reflection of the story of the first 6 months. And if you do that, or if you actually you listened to that at the time, you'll probably remember that something was revealed very early. And that was the pilots were telling us that there was essentially an implicit understanding all over the place, and everyone who works in it, that essentially people moving about, people moving more and being active, was central to their goals and ambitions, whether that's bringing communities together, whether it's people's personal health, whether it was getting people into different modes of transport. Everyone recognised it had a role, but really importantly, it became very clear that that role wasn't necessarily very clear or present. So people didn't necessarily think of increasing activity or their role in it as their work. It wasn't in strategies, it wasn't necessarily mentioned in budgets, it wasn't in people's development plans. So it was sort of there, but not there at all. And so the last 6 months, we've seen this real focus on creating energy and creating action amongst all those people who have a role to play in shaping a place that makes activity easy and exciting for people. So that's been really around things like building relationships, creating shared purpose, a shared sense of what matters, helping people to understand how activity is a vehicle for what they're trying to achieve rather than an end in itself. And so that's meant that communication, as we would typically think of it, has become a central part of the work of the pilots. So not so much we're going to do something and then someone needs to write a press release about it, but more, how are we talking about this thing? How can other people see how this connects with them? How can we co-create a purpose that everyone can get on board with? How do we create energy? And then crucially, how do we turn energy into action? So bearing in mind that as soon as you think about everything and everyone who might influence activity in a place, it soon becomes clear that it's impossible that they would come back and get everything approved by some central person like Jason. The whole point is everyone goes away and does something which is sensible and in some way coherent with each other. And that's quite a thing to orchestrate. So the pilots have been looking at how you can create energy, yes, but also how can you help people to start to feel like they can take action in a way that feels like it joins up with other people. And we've seen great examples of that, like pointers for practice, principles for ways of working, co-creating principles for investment. So when we each invest or commission, we will invest for principles like this. We are going to work together like that. We'll make these commitments. So not about the details, but about how we're going to work and the journey that we're on and ultimately where we're trying to get to. So essentially, this sort of how can we get this thing going, energizing, but also moving together in some sort of purposeful direction. And of course, it's not a quick fix, is it, Jason?
Not at all, and it is a kind of a long journey that very much kind of needs sustaining. And I think from certainly some of the work that we've done in Essex and to share with you this morning, we absolutely recognise that inspiration transforms understanding into action. And there's something about a movement approach. Actually, if we're inspirational and we find those inspirational people, they'll create an understanding that in turn then translates very much into action. I suppose a couple of stories just to share about how we brought that to life here in Essex was, firstly, the unusual suspects. We're absolutely clear that there's an array of key partners, individuals, community champions across our county that we absolutely need to engage with. And they are very clear about a potential social mission that they may well have. And it's for us to understand the role that we need to play, be that the invisible hand, but that supporting role that allows them to, in their own terms, create their own movement. We can't create a movement, but we can support a movement from behind the scenes. I think that's something that we've absolutely found. So a couple of examples, we're doing some work in one of our areas with a pub. Everyone laughs when I talk about a pub because they think that there's an alternative motive here. And absolutely there isn't, because if we think about a pub in this particular area, it's at the heart of the community, and it's actually where people gather to talk, to engage, to discuss what matters to them. And so how do we dip into and create a movement around physical activity with those people owning that? And that's really quite exciting, and we're doing some work around that. Happy to share that within details later on. I think the second important, and it's really exciting bit of work for us, is that we've come across one of these individuals, and her name's Charlotte. I know Charlotte won't mind me sharing her story, but Charlotte, a single mum in Tendring, in Jaywick, one of our areas, and she decided that she needed to get more physically active, and she started doing sit-ups in her kitchen room floor on her own, and started to put that on Facebook. And her friends started to hear about what she was doing, and that circulated very quickly to the point that actually her kitchen wasn't big enough and her house wasn't big enough to continue the movement that, without her realising, that she'd created. And there's something about how, from an invisible hand point of view, we support Charlotte to carry on what she's doing. Not about us getting our logo over it and getting in the way, but actually recognising that actually Charlotte's strength around sustaining what she's doing is critical without us interfering. So the only support we've given to Charlotte is to help her to get better qualifications so she can become more skilled in what she's delivering. It's as simple as that, and really quite exciting. Charlotte herself is coming up with her own inspiration, so I guarantee everyone listening this morning, there's something in your wardrobe that you've brought at some point, an item of clothing where you think, what was I thinking? We all got one, because I've got one myself. And so what Charlotte's asked people locally to do is donate that item of clothing that you've got in your wardrobe. And she's created her own second-hand charity shop, and she's selling those items on. And in return for selling those on, she's creating some investment that's enabled her to buy some equipment, to be able to buy opportunities to hire additional facilities. And that is really exciting about how she's created all that herself. So there's something about growing a movement, understanding the role that we need to play, and how we actually support that, because that becomes more sustainable. Much more than anything that I would put into that area, Charlotte's created something that we feel has got longevity, which is really quite exciting.
Yeah, I've got loads of those things in my wardrobe. Excellent. For Charlotte. And one of the things that you told me, which has stuck with me, is you were saying that when Charlotte first posted that, she positioned it as getting together for a glass of wine and a good cry.
Absolutely.
And I think that really reminded me that something about the way that this works means that messages are important, but messengers are even more important. Because in the same conversation you told me about William Bird, who's really eminent in his field and working with you closely on evaluation, I'm sure we're going to get onto that, being able to talk really authentically to a room of GPs, because that is his area of comfort and confidence, and that making the message so much more credible because he could tailor it for his room. But then you think about Charlotte and how that message is completely different because she knows how to be authentic with the people that she's connected to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Authenticity is really, really important, and I think the examples that Naomi just shared with you really demonstrate how we've taken those different approaches. So Charlotte and the engagement she can present and kind of the connection she has with the community, which is really quite exciting, far outstretches anything that we'll be able to do. William with the doctors, and I suppose also, Naomi, just to share with you, also politicians, senior leaders. So the ability to be able to connect with a movement with senior leaders. So last summer at County Council, they debated for an hour the importance of physical activity and passed a full motion. Now that full motion wasn't done by me, it was done by the politicians of the Cabinet. And so again, there's a movement there happening within their own right that hopefully influences exactly the journey that we're all trying to influence here around physical activity. Brilliant.
So we've seen really tangible opportunities emerging, and I can't list them all, but we're at the stage now where these are really bubbling up. So there's examples like whole adult social care departments building physical activity into their visits. We've had examples of major developers looking at redevelopments and building in active design principles. So real opportunities to genuinely build physical activity into the most influential things that are going on in the places, but starting with this principle of growing a movement. And then really deeply connected to that, I think these things are all connected, as I'm sure you'll hear as we talk through. They're quite hard to separate, really. But there is a huge theme that has come out, especially in the last 6 months, where the local delivery pilots are uncovering the importance of investing time and working in ways that prioritise building trust. So I keep saying this. As soon as I started to see how strongly this was coming through as a theme, I sort of challenged myself, and I thought, how different is that? What would it look like if I made all of my decisions and took my actions based on the things that were going to build the most trust? How do I normally make decisions? And I started to think, well, I make decisions for loads of different reasons. There's the written rules, there's the unwritten rules, there's the things you think you need to do, there's the pressure you feel from your boss, there's the fact we feel everything should be done quickly. But actually, very rarely do I make decisions based on really what will build the most trust with the people I'm doing this with. And that's just a personal reflection because it made me realise actually how different our world, literally, and our little worlds as individuals would look and feel like if we all thought about creating trust. So why does that matter? It matters because it's really starting to emerge that trust is the key ingredient for true collaboration. And we've chosen this quote here, which is actually pinched from Stephen Covey in his book, The Speed of Trust, because it indicates that trust is not a soft concept. It is a real thing that can either hold things up and block progress significantly or can genuinely be the catalyst for progress. So there's lots of ways that this has come out, partially through seeing how the erosion of trust has affected people before. So partnerships that are slow to get off the ground because previous actions, behaviours, interventions have eroded trust, where trust is needed to be rebuilt before any real progress can be made. But especially in communities where it's become clear that in some communities trust is really broken down with different people in different parts of the system. And that has become a real blocker to relationships and progress. The flip side of that being really, I suppose, constructive, is where strong trust has been created, all sorts of opportunities have poured out of that, and that's where the greatest progress has been made in the greatest possible pace. So this has led the pilots to try to find ways of signalling that this is happening in a way that is meant to feel different, and that is prioritising building trust, and that gives people the confidence that it's a real opportunity to trust and connect and have a go at doing things differently. So if I talk about what that actually looks like, and I'm sure you've got your own examples, Jason, there's things like some of the pilots developing themselves on things like thinking environments, which basically comes down to when you bring people together in a space, how do we get the best out of those people? How do you create the space for people to think and work at their best possible way? Creative engagement training. So how do we get past post-it notes, and how do we start creatively talking to each other about what's possible? and moving physically into communities. So some local delivery pilots have physically moved their teams and situated themselves in the communities that they are trying to build trust within. Recruiting local delivery pilot roles from partners and communities that we're trying to build trust with. And also co-producing. So moving past consultation, we'll come on to this in a second, moving towards co-production. So genuinely being open to co-producing things together. And that's come out in lots of different ways. In some examples, even communities co-producing ideas and then voting on the ones that actually get investment. So building trust, it can sound very sort of intangible and even a little bit soft, but it's feeling very important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think trust is very much for us, and I think, and hopefully you'll all agree, the basis of how we develop relationships and move things forward. I think we absolutely pride ourselves, and I think it's really important to share about relationship building, because actually you need to create a relationship in order to be able to build trust, and very much moving away from a transactional relationship, but actually a real relationship that's got some authenticity to it. And sometimes that moves away from the traditional approaches of the email and assuming that an email is going to land in the way that you wish it to land in order to kind of create that relationship. Sometimes it is about that face-to-face and that potentially that walk in the corridor relationships, which you just mentioned, Naomi, with some of our colleagues, including Essex herself. We've got some capacity on the ground, and they absolutely are in the heart of the community and building that confidence and that relationship to make it feel, importantly, that this is different. This is not about doing to, but it's about doing with and creating with people around what's actually needed to attempt to challenge that we have around tackling activity. And that, for me, makes this really quite exciting. I think are really, really different. We, for example, in Essex, are going through some asset-based community development training. And some of the principles that attach itself to that are so critical that actually, let's just go out there and explore. Let's go out there and start a conversation. But actually, some people don't understand how to start and engage a conversation. So let's skill people up to understand what it is about the art of the conversation, because that, for us, builds trust and builds a relationship that enables us to be able to move this journey and this very kind of exciting opportunity that we have on. I think what's also quite important for us that we've been able to do is that trust also comes from achievements as well. And so Active Essex, we're hosted at the County Council, but actually we've delivered from way back from London 2012. And there's a trust in the organisation that actually we were able to deliver an Olympic Games and a Tour de France and other such exciting things that actually people trust Active Essex as a valued landscape partner. And so there's something about how you're able to demonstrate trust to partners in your ability to be able to deliver, which ultimately helps to build those kind of relationships. So those relationships are not only by me because I happen to be the exciting role of leading the pilot, but actually that trust is embedded upon across the whole of the team, and for them to build upon that opportunity to create those kind of really strong relationships. It was really interesting last week. We did a sharing day, and we had some colleagues from Sport England and other organisations come down to join us. And when we were walking through one of our towns, someone spoke to a couple of elderly ladies and said, what do you think of the high street? And their first reaction was, well, it's not very good, is it? We've got all the cheap shops and it's the council's fault. And straight away the council was blamed for British Home Stores, Woolworths and Marks and Spencer closing, creating big, gaping gaps in the high street. And there's this example there that if they trusted the local authority and the local authority understood the role they had to play with the community, those ladies wouldn't be saying that, because we all know those three key shops closing have got absolutely nothing to do with the local authority, but actually there's a perception there that actually the council is to blame. And so I think there's a real challenge around this particular pilot area about how we build the trust with the community to actually understand actually we're all wanting to collaborate and work together. And so actually there's a bit of a ground zero relationship there about how we start that relationship building and get them to trust us. And sometimes that trust might not be me going in with my shirt and tie. It might be about finding those community capacity builders, those agents who can display and can deliver those messages. So I think it's something about, comes back to the first point, understanding your role, understanding the role that you need to play when you need to be in the mix and when you need to take that step back and empower other people to kind of lead that conversation. I think it's something that we're learning, that's how you develop trust at the speed and the essence that we're trying to do here.
Thank you. What was so interesting, I think, was having the privilege of being there for that visit, was how unscripted everyone was. So we were moving around communities, meeting people that we were working with, and having so many conversations with people who were able to talk openly and authentically about how they were connecting with this work in their own words. But how so much of that was, on message, if you will, but without any scripting. And it makes you realise when people have powerfully emotionally connected and trust each other, you know, you don't need the scripting, you don't need the briefing.
Absolutely, very much so.
So our next theme actually is, again, very connected. This is an ongoing theme. And again, for anyone who's been on this journey with us, this is something that you may have heard before. For anyone who hasn't, this is something you could go back to. So not only did we raise this in the initial story from 6 months ago, because it was one of the very first things that emerged from the pilot learning and reflection, we also ran a separate webinar on it called Engaging Communities. So if you'd like to go back and hear some more tangible, practical examples around that, then please do. But if I talk about this a bit more, it became clear very quickly in the pilot work that many degrees of separation have emerged between the people who make decisions and take actions that affect communities and those communities themselves. So what we mean by that is that decisions were being made in one context, they were being experienced and felt in another, and the bridges between those worlds had somehow disappeared. And if they hadn't disappeared, they were weaker than they perhaps have been in the past. So this was with full recognition, and I don't want to be sort of judgmental, because we all know the really challenging context of operating locally at the moment. And many of the sort of opportunities and connections into communities don't exist now that used to be there. But it does still mean, I think, confronting this uncomfortable empathy gap. So pilots were talking about what it means to try and bridge that gap in the first 6 months, recognising that it was there and starting to experiment with ways to bridge it. And the last 6 months have seen pilots really getting to grips with what building empathy and real community engagement means in reality. And then I think, interestingly, in light of what you've just said, Jason, the other side we might add to that is empathy with each other in the system. We can lack empathy with other people who we see as working, you know, in our organisations even, or for the same agendas. We can get to the point where we don't really understand each other. So approaches to this have really varied. There's been all sorts of examples of meeting members of communities in their worlds. So if you go back to the webinar, you'll hear stories about going into libraries, starting conversations whilst people are being drawn by caricaturists. But there are many examples of recruiting researchers within communities. So training people up within communities who have authentic connections already in those communities and helping them to gather information, so that it isn't, for example, an agency coming in and doing consultation to people, but it's genuine inquiry and genuine questioning by people you trust. And in the same way that builds up skills for those people, which are useful to them. So I'm not going to talk too much because there is that separate webinar and time is ticking. But we feel we've made real progress in this area in the last 6 months, and there's actually a lot to learn here. But if I can convey one thing which feels like perhaps the most useful transferable learning from this theme so far, it's language. And connected to that questions, the questions that we ask and the way that we ask them. So there's been real honesty from several of the pilots about attempts to understand people, asking questions that were pretty frank. So examples that were given were essentially, why are you inactive? Or why are you not active? Or why won't you join us in this partnership? And that led to quite a set of responses that we may all be quite familiar with. They're a little bit defensive, over-rationalised, you know, it's because of time, it's because of money, because I don't have the opportunity. And the pilots realised that those weren't the questions that were going to elicit the most interesting, broad, insightful responses. So one of the best things that I think we can do is we can gather up the questions that we've all found to be more powerful. I think across the pilots there's quite a few questions that feel like powerful questions now that open up conversation and drive at real insight. But a lovely example came via a guy, John Little, who's now working in Greater Manchester. And in one of his previous roles, he worked for Minnie Holland in Waltham Forest, if that means anything to anyone. I know it's very well known now. He talks about how they were consulting with residents, and I won't get this word for word right, but the question he first asked people was what improvements they wanted to be made to their roads. And they were doing all sorts of things. They were sort of shutting down these rat runs between busy roads, putting street furniture around. And he realised that the answers that they were getting to that demonstrated that everybody was answering that from the perspective of the driver. So people were thinking about roads as drivers, so how easy it was to drop the kids off to school and then get to the station. And of course, the whole point of the work, the whole point of that investment was to try and change the balance so that the place was designed for pedestrians and cyclists more than it was for drivers. So they changed the question and they asked, what sort of street do you want to live in? And they realised then that they were getting a whole heap of different responses because people were thinking as a resident. And the responses were about somewhere where my kids can play outside and I don't have to be afraid. Where if it's a sunny night, we can go outside and sit somewhere. Where there's somewhere that we can gather. Where there's somewhere where there isn't traffic sometimes. Where it's green. Where there's somewhere to sit at all, because, of course, in many places there aren't. And he said that changing that question fundamentally changed the direction of their work. And it can sound like semantics, but it's something that I think is really interesting for us all to think about, is the questions we ask ourselves and each other, and what sort of information that's going to get from people. So at the moment feels the most transferable, and on a practical sense, as I say, we could share some of those questions, couldn't we, that we found more powerful?
Absolutely, Naomi. And I think I'm smiling at the moment because this is such an important area for us to really get to grips with and understand. It's interesting, I was just thinking, I was reflecting, last night on the news, I was listening to a group of elderly pensioners, understandably, dismaying their concern as to why the government stopped the TV licence for them, for the over 75s. Mm-hmm. And on the flip side, we see the list of staff who are paid huge amounts of money on the BBC at the same time. And so is there, think about the empathy gap between what the BBC have done and the timing that they've done it. There's a really good live example for me on what I was listening to last night. I actually totally missed the opportunity of understanding the empathy gap between the people that are paying their licence over 75 and ultimately what they're paying some of the TV stars. And for us, that's something I think that's really important that we've learned. The answer is not starting with physical activity. It's actually starting with what are the challenges in your everyday life? And I think I just want to anchor back to one of the purposes of, we believe strongly, as to why the pilots are important, which is about whole system, about operationalising how we work across the system. So we may well find out in some of those conversations, for example, in Basildon, that there may well be a challenge around people being able to get to facilities, or transport may be an issue. So from a system perspective, we're going to be engaging with the highway team and the planners to understand, well, actually, how can we affect change? Because these are some of the challenges. It doesn't matter how many Zumba classes I set up, I'm not going to turn up. How can I affect the challenge in the system, which is about transport? And for us, I think, really importantly, this is where the empathy gap comes in, understanding what are the challenges of the individuals as to why they can't be active, and how through system collaboration we can make a really big impact. It could be education, it could be social care, it could be anything, but ultimately from an Essex perspective, we absolutely want to understand how the pilot can influence some of that system thinking. Recently, our Essex Plan Design Guide has got a section in all about health and wellbeing, and we've incorporated the active design principles. So that's a start for us, because we're demonstrating how planners are now working within the stream of physical activity to understand they have a part to play in trying to fix and solve some of those kind of solutions. But for us, I suppose the important message is, let's understand what some of those wider challenges are of the individuals, because only then can you understand empathy. If the BBC had spoken to those over 75 before they made that decision, could their decisions look very different, I think. And that's, I think, a really stark lesson, I think, that we've taken away from that.
Thanks for that, Jason, because actually you've just rooted that back into why that matters, why that empathy gap matters, and that getting back to the root of problems rather than almost the sticking plasters, going back to the roots. And there's lots of stories that have emerged, and we reference one quite a lot. So a woman who lived in one of the most deprived communities in one place, talking about the fact that she would love to go swimming. She loves swimming. It's always been her escape. She now has caring responsibilities for her husband, who's older than her. Because social care has been cut back, she feels she can barely leave the house. And when she does, she would love to go swimming, but the bus service has been reduced. And even if she could get the bus, it would stop on the wrong side of a busy dual carriageway to the leisure centre. So that whole community can't actually get the bus to that leisure centre. And so you start to understand that the changes that need to be made are outside of offers at the leisure centre and well outside of marketing. And, there are opportunities and huge possibilities for people to get back into the things they really desperately want to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, again, this probably won't be surprising to anyone who's listening, because all of this, I think, does sound quite different to the way we all typically work on a day-to-day basis. And connected very much to the fact that it feels and looks different, I think it's fair to say that all of the local delivery pilots have told us that they've experienced increased pressure over the last 6 months. And what we mean by pressure is the feeling from senior leadership, colleagues, even from communities and partners, of when is some stuff going to happen? And I think through unpicking that, without being dismissive at all, and we'll come on to this in a second because we must have empathy ourselves around this, interpretation there is that Sport England even, and suggestion of Sport England funding typically means that something will be bought or something tangible will emerge, whether that's something being built or some equipment or some training. And there might be some unrest at some perceived lack of tangible activity. So even though all of these connections are being made, huge possibilities are starting to be realised, the problems that people really experience starting to be fixed, it's unsettling for people that you can't almost point at stuff. And I suppose being a little bit crueler, no ribbons can be snipped. I think that's something that we just need to confront, that there is a degree of discomfort when doing anything differently. And in many ways, people default back to their familiar ideas of progress, don't they? So in quite traditional project management sense, have you done the things you promised you'd do? What are my outputs? What have you produced? And is everything going exactly how you thought it was going to go? And the work of the pilot seems to be more what is emerging, what are the opportunities that are coming out, how can we make the most of them, and following the energy. So I understand that it's been really important for those working in the pilots, and of course those working in the pilots are getting bigger and bigger, the numbers as the movement grows, to hold their nerve in the face of pressure to justify time being spent, or to release funding into stuff that people feel should be supported, or to see things happening that make it visible and obvious that investment's being used in the right places. A couple of things that feel really important about work like this is that way to balance the long-term value that's being created, tackling those real root sort of challenges and problems, with some of the more shorter-term value that people would recognise, back to that building trust. It also shows that working in a more collaborative way doesn't always mean harmony, that not everyone's going to agree. Tell us what that felt like for you.
I think it's really interesting, and you raised the point that it absolutely feels different, is different, and the relationship that we have with partners and Sport England on this journey. The phrase that I coined is, it's not about the bats and balls, it's not a dash for the bats and balls, and that takes nerve, because people are used to a way of working with Sport England around, as you just described, Naomi, and I think that what's been really important for us in Essex is to be able to anchor our thinking as a team, and to be able to keep the line and hold the nerve. And absolutely, there has been an array of difficult conversations around actually, well, why haven't we cut the ribbon? Why haven't we done this? Why haven't we done that? And actually, it's anchoring it back to demonstrate actually this is different. This is about the system, about trying to get a collaborative approach to working, and about to be able to influence change, but also understand actually what are the needs and the want of the community. And that's the bit that actually is capturing people's attention. The fact that we're saying, as you just described earlier on, understanding the empathy gap, being able to understand how we grow a movement, and not necessarily by doing two people, which we tend to always do, is what's making us feel different, but also giving us some space. And it has created some space for us that allows us to be able to kind of have that thinking time, to be able to understand actually how can we create what clearly is for us next practice, because if we'd cracked it, it would have been good practice already. So we're creating that next practice, and we absolutely feel custodials of, we want to get this right, and we want to make sure that it feels and kind of looks different. I think some of the examples to kind of just to share things happening, we had a really good example where a particular project that we had was able to obtain a shop front in a shopping centre, focusing on mental health, which is really quite exciting. And what she was able to do was to kind of create some mental health classes, some mindfulness classes, which linked to physical activity and walking in the community. But once the 6 months trial period was over, she then received a business rates bill for just over £16,000. Now, bearing in mind that actually she was very much kind of hand to mouth, it was very much a new initiative, and people weren't paying a huge amount of money to come and take part in the classes. There was no way she could find £16,000. But what then happened, quite simply, was that a computer at the council looked at the business name and threw out what we always do in the process: that's 16,000, that's a business, you owe £16,000. And so there was something about how actually those colleagues were asking to go back and push back to Revs and Bens in the authority and say, hold on a minute, if we are saying that we're about the locality, about the people, we want to affect change, it's about the health and well-being of our residents, why are we looking to charge business rates to this particular business? Because actually, it's actually saving us money by bearing in mind some of the really positive outputs that it's presenting. And that was a hold your nerve conversation. We absolutely stood our ground, and I'm really pleased to say that business is not paying business rates now because it is contributing to the wider outcomes of that authority. But that's a really example of how you have to hold your nerve and very much have those kind of difficult conversations. Some of the processy stuff, I'm not going to deny, we can't get away from. I think I got to version 8 of a cabinet paper, which was a good news story, but that just shows you that there still is a culture and behaviour within the public sector that we're not going to crack overnight. It's going to take time to be able to do that. But I think as long as we understand that and know what the limitations are, we can continue to kind of combat that and work collaboratively to get there. But yeah, hands up, it's not easy. Holding nerve is not easy, and absolutely you are up for criticism and debate, but I think it's important if you're true to the word of what we're trying to achieve here. And so sometimes you do have to do that and be standing proud and say no.
And this phrase has emerged, hasn't it? Stubborn on the vision, flexible on the details. Which, again, is a bit unsettling for normal project management approaches.
Well, I had a one-to-one with a chief exec a few weeks ago, and exactly that, Naomi. He said to me, so where's the milestones then, and where's the detail behind what we're doing? And it was a really difficult conversation. I had to hold my nerve to say, actually, this is not linear, actually. This is about developing organically, and actually you need to trust me, you need to trust us. And it comes back to our earlier theme around how you develop trust and build that relationship. So I think we've now developed trust and relationships with a cadet of partners that I think allows us to step away from that linear approach that you described. But it's not always easy.
No, it's not, is it? And actually, a couple of the pilots, actually more than that, quite a few, have been talking about realising that part of managing that is building teams' resilience. So that much more consciousness about team building, resilience building, telling ourselves, reinforcing to ourselves all the time the story of what we're doing and why we're doing this when it gets hard.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's one of the things that we found really important. Everybody loves a story, so to be able to tell a story, but more importantly, the lived experiences. So actually, we're going to, at some point, roll out Charlotte. Earlier on, you heard about Charlotte. And her lived experience is really powerful. And that sometimes takes away some of that challenge that we've been describing earlier on, because when people hear the lived experience put in front of them face to face, they very, very find it hard to disagree and to challenge very much the process and direction of what you're trying to do. So I think that's something really important. Find your lived experiences and make sure you play them into the appropriate opportunities that you have, because that's really powerful, really powerful.
That actually connects so much to our final theme, and soon we'll be done talking and we'll be inviting questions. We can see them flooding in, which is fantastic. I suppose to wrap up really on a really interesting topic that brings a lot of these things together. It really is becoming clear that an inevitability of working in a way that feels different and doesn't always produce the sorts of reassurances that we're all used to and familiar with, means there's a need to demonstrate value on a nearly constant basis in order to reassure people and maintain confidence and build trust. And that is causing us all to think really deeply about evaluation, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I think everyone will recognise the typical evaluation pattern is we know exactly what we're going to do. Broadly, we know how it's going to happen. We're going to do it in this time frame, and I'm talking very sort of simplistically. At the end of that, we will gather in all of the data and we'll think about whether it worked and what we could learn from it.
Absolutely.
But in a world that Jason's describing and the other pilots, where people are saying, hang on a minute, I'm putting a lot of trust in you. Is this doing something? And it's been a while now, Jason. Is this doing something?
Absolutely. Yes, it is.
Yeah. There's a need to talk about the value we're creating in quite a live way, isn't there? As well as, of course, robustly evaluate. So part of that is this, we're talking to you now about the value we think we're creating in terms we possibly wouldn't have done before, holding our own nerve there and hoping that this is useful to people. But part of it, I think, is learning to evaluate differently, isn't it, and creating different sorts of evaluation approaches that we've perhaps not necessarily done to this extent before. So essentially, we shifted from ultimately proving the value of this in the future at some time to being able to talk about the value this week. And another really interesting side of this is value to who? Asking ourselves this question a lot. So going back to that growing a movement, when people are giving their energy, giving their time, adding their resource to something, the things that they value and need to see as valuable coming out of this as an evaluation aren't always the same as each other, and certainly not as government necessarily nationally, or even the government locally. So they may say, well, I will understand if this has been valuable because of X. Well, that might be different to him over there and her over here. And communities themselves are the people ultimately, if you don't mind the expression, being messed around with the most. And how often we talk back to communities about what they value, perhaps, about what's happening. So another great story, it came from John Little again, was when the Mini Holland work started to produce, I suppose, value and results. At first it was talked about, as I understand it, very much in the sort of government terms, air quality and particles and modal shift. And of course that was valuable to some people in the system. You can't ignore that. To some people that's valuable. But they then received an email from a woman saying, since you started this, for the first time in 15 years, I've been able to lie on a sort of warm, balmy night with my windows open, reading a book on my bed without 20,000 cars going past, and the pollution and the noise. And that's her value. That's why it was worth messing around with her life. And that made him realise we're not talking to the community about the things they value. So this has become really quite complex, hasn't it? And we're trying to find our way through.
Absolutely. And as you said, just picking up some of the points you said to echo, evaluation is at the front and centre of this. Our evaluation partner, when we appoint, will be on the journey with us. They're not an extension to the team, but they're part of the team. And that helps us to be able to reflect on them, as you just described, the importance of reflection about what we've done, what has and hasn't worked, and about how we share it with partners kind of ongoing. There's something for us about immersing yourself in our place. And so I reckon certainly for us about demonstrating value is we've learned a lot from going to other places. So spending time talking to other partners, going to their place and seeing their challenges, I think is something really important that we absolutely urge people to kind of take on board. I suppose something for us as well, value for us is when everyone else is doing what you're trying to do. That kind of journey, you're demonstrating the value that everyone's signed up, and you're starting to see lots of positive things happen because people subscribe to that kind of value that you're trying to create. And of course, the ability to be able to know when to lead and know when to step back. Really important around the valuing part, actually, around how you need to understand the role that you need to play, is absolutely kind of critical. And this is a journey, absolutely it's a journey. It's about how we operationalise whole system approach to be able to demonstrate the value of what we're trying to achieve. So I think this is really quite exciting, and something, as you said, demonstrating value means different things to different people. It's our job to understand what that means when you bring them to the table as you build that trust and you build that relationship and you understand that empathy. Really, really important. All connected, as you can see.
And in really practical terms, probably one of the the next things we should share is some of the evaluation thinking and approaches. That could be quite useful for people. But at very top level, it's more emphasis on process evaluation, as we typically talk about it. So what is happening and why do we think that matters rather than necessarily results. And also this difference between, okay, we're trying to achieve this at the long run, but what might happen before that? What might happen before that? What might happen before that? So what are the indications that something's changing that gives us confidence that this is going in the right direction, even though that big dial, if you'll excuse the expression, hasn't moved yet?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Naomi and Jason. I think that might be the title for maybe another webinar.
Yeah.
Great reflections, and good to hear first-hand experience directly in a pilot. So particular thanks to Jason for sharing his thoughts and experiences this morning. Hope you found that useful down the line and what was said resonated with you. I'm sure it did, looking at the kind of questions that are coming in. We've got just under 10 minutes now for some Q&A, so we won't be able to get through all of the questions that have come in, but what we will commit to doing is the ones that we can't answer now, we'll put together an FAQ and make sure that's circulated around to those that have been able to join us. But we do have a few minutes, as I said, to pick up a couple. The first question, Jason, actually is one for you, if that's okay.
Okay.
Jason, how have you managed the politicians in the context of their understanding of the commitment to the long term? I think your language, the dash for bats and balls versus building the system.
Yeah, no, thanks, Adam. I think what's really important first thing is to how we engage others to talk the story. So actually it's not necessarily always about me having to champion the agenda. It's about how do I subscribe and bring people on the journey with me. And I think that's really important. A good example of that is the full council motion that ended up taking place last summer. That wasn't me. I didn't write it. I didn't ask it to happen. But actually others felt entrusted to want to take that conversation forward. I think critically for us, it goes back to the foundations of a place and to be able to understand actually what's that place trying to achieve. So we've done a huge amount of work, and it's been a journey in Essex, but literally 18 months ago there was the creation of a new health and wellbeing board strategy. And actually outside of that journey, I was championing and prodding to make sure that physical activity came out as one of those priorities. When it did, that absolutely gives us that kind of the gravitas and that momentum to be able to influence change with the politicians, because they recognise that actually it's a priority that's ascribed into others. So actually all 12 of our local authorities and our 2 unitaries have identified physical activity as a priority. Therefore politicians are subscribed to that journey. So actually it's not a quick fix, it's a journey of positioning in and sometimes ensuring that you bring others with you on that journey to kind of position that conversation. So I'm not the advocate, there's lots of advocates. I might start the conversation and others are able to follow it through in the different settings that I might not be able to get to. But ultimately you kind of put, I think we called it the other day, a family, a group of cousins that you have working actually and trying to champion that message to be able to land actually what you're trying to achieve, Adam.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think it's probably also worth reflecting on the wider piece of work that was going on in Essex around the willingness and desire to work in a different way, to coin the phrase, to work in a more systemic way, not just on physical activity agenda, but on other agendas, which was a real strength point for you in terms of taking this work on. Okay, thank you. Just a further question, both to Naomi and to Jason. Have you got any tips for building relationships and trust when there is the pressure of time-sensitive funding? How do you overcome short timescales without skipping the trust-building part? I think that's something that we can, you've started to touch on that in terms of some of the things you said earlier on in the presentation, but something that has challenged all of the pilots. Can we have some thoughts on that?
I think from our perspective, certainly within the county of Essex, we've done the short-term thing, and we still have a challenge of inactivity where something like 30% of our population are inactive. So there's kind of a crying out for a change in approach. And I think in order to be able to do that, it comes back to the importance of building people and partners for the long haul, for the long journey, and that takes time. And I think that, as I said earlier on, the ability that we've been able to have, and Adam just kind of shared a little bit, that Essex was on a journey as a county around its vision. Clearly, Essex vision says that it can't be done on its own without collaboration. So there's my hook, there's my opportunity. How do I dovetail the lens of physical activity in that environment to demonstrate actually we can be part of this journey with you? So I'd suggest if you're thinking about that strategic picture locally around what are the drivers, the strategic drivers in your place that allow you to think about how you can shoehorn physical activity onto that agenda. And I very rarely go into a meeting and talk about physical activity. I end up talking about lots of other people's outcomes to demonstrate how actually what we're doing can contribute to that. And I think that very much is the trick. Now, that's not selling your soul, that's not changing what you believe in, it's just understanding the dynamics. And I suppose the word that I'd like to think, being emotionally intelligent, being intelligent to the place and the opportunity that you have to how you can work through the agendas.
Yeah, in a really practical sense, having picked up across the 12 the things that are going on, I suppose just totally understand that in some contexts you are working in confines. You haven't got, if you will, the permission that you have in others. And it does seem that there are things that can be done, and I want to say pretty rapidly, although of course with the caveat that building true trust is an investment of time, it does take time. But small things build big trust pretty fast, and the examples that are coming out are really careful thoughts about the way that conversations and interactions, and especially meetings, are set up and managed. That sounds small, but it does have an effect. So, for example, what's the power dynamic? Does somebody always introduce and everybody else has to follow the beat of their drum? Thinking environments, if you do a basic Google, is something really interesting to look at. So how you set up a meeting, how that meeting runs, and the simple tools and techniques that you can use to ensure everybody feels like they have a voice and they've been heard, builds trust rapidly. So examples that we've actually adopted through this process is the idea of a round. So everybody, you're posed a question, everybody gets 2 minutes of uninterrupted speaking, basically, on their responses to that question. No one's on their iPads. Everyone's looking at the eyes of the person speaking. You trust that you're going to be given that 2 minutes to say whatever you want to say. And in return, you trust people that they won't take 10 minutes instead of 2 minutes. So these are simple techniques that somebody will leave a meeting feeling that they weren't rushed, that they were heard, and that somebody actually listened and took on board what they were saying. But there's also small behavioural things. So they say trust is a mixture of character and competence. Character is authenticity, integrity. But competence is basically, I've done the things I've said I'll do. When I promised you I'd send something, I sent it. When you asked for this, you got it. And that sounds really basic as well, but those are the things that construct trust. That we live through the commitments that we make, and that can be big and small. It's the big and small things that break trust as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. We've got one more. I'd like to squeeze in one more question if I can. I'm going to direct that one to you, Naomi, although I'd probably contribute to answering this one as well. How involved are the LDPs with the evaluation process, and at what level?
Okay, that's a really good question. So I'd say entirely running it, integral. Yeah, so if I explain a little bit the structure, which I know is the boring bit but helps explain. We do have a national evaluation partner, that's ISF Research. Their job is to synthesize really the information that comes from 12 separate local evaluation pilots. Local delivery pilot evaluations. Of course, they're only useful if they're broadly connected. So if they were utterly different, looking at completely different things, you wouldn't be able to look at them and find anything useful across them. But we decided quite early to create maximum possible flexibility for the pilots because of what you've just been hearing. The starting points of the pilots, the context of the place, the sorts of things that are going on, with who, against what issues are so different that if we tried to take 12 identical evaluation approaches, we'd miss a lot of the good stuff. So we have a framework. It holds a few sort of primary measures, I suppose, together, and it does ask pilots to evaluate against 5 things in common, but everything else is shaped locally. And then, of course, we have the job of synthesizing that and trying to decide what that tells us. So essentially, the evaluations are entirely driven by the pilots.
Absolutely, yeah, echo that.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think, sorry we couldn't get through all of the questions. We will put those out as an FAQ because there are some other great questions that have come through as we've been talking. Thanks to everyone for attending the webinar. Please remember the presentation will be available on demand in the next couple of days, and all those that were registered will get an email with the link. But you can also keep in touch with what's happening across the local delivery pilots via our website. You'll see the link on the screen. But if you go to the sportengland.org website link and look at our local delivery pilot pages, you'll see pen portraits and further information. And we'll also keep you updated on the further upcoming webinars and our next wave of community of learning workshops, which will happen later in the year. So I think without further ado, it just remains for me to say finally thanks once again. Hope you have a great rest of the day, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.